actually have two types, two different flavors. One is called acetoacetate, and the other one is called beta hydroxybutyrate. Technically, there is another one. If you really want to be specific, there's even acetone. But really, this one is going to be breathed out of exhale. Okay? So that is another thing that we should remember can happen in the fasting state. So far, what do we have? Glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis. We have glutamine synthesis. We have the urea cycle happening. We even have lipolysis that could be occurring here. So we can have lipolysis, that's the seventh part. And we can have beta oxidation. And if there's excessively high levels of acetyl-CoA, we can take liver antibodies. So that's the significance that you should understand here with the liver that is happening, what's happening in the fasting state. Okay, so now what I want to do is we got a good chunk of the metabolism down. Again, if you guys really want a more in detail look at this stuff, we covered this in our metabolism playlist. So go there, check out all those videos. I just wanted to get a basic little thing here for how the liver is involved in metabolism. Alright guys, so now we're going to talk about, actually let me flip these guys here. I think it's better if we talk about protein factory first. I think it's going to make more sense, it's going to flow better right here. Let's go ahead and switch these, and let's make this one here. Let's make this the protein factory. Let's cover this as the protein factory. Because you know the liver has so many proteins that you can synthesize. You guys will see it's unbelievable. And then we'll talk about storage last. Okay? So protein factory. Obviously you know that the liver has the ability to make tons and tons and tons of protein. Now, here's the thing. What I want us to look at this in is I want us to look at this in a bunch of different ways. Alright, so this guy makes tons and tons and tons of protein. So what are some of the proteins here? Out of all of these, I really, guys, don't forget this one. This is the most significant protein that the liver makes, and this is called albumin. You guys already know that albumin accounts for like 60% of your plasma proteins. Now, what is the function of albumin? Albumin maintains your osmotic pressure. So for example, let's say I had a capillary here. So here is a little capillary. You know that in the capillary there's hydrostatic pressure, pressure that pushes things out of the actual capillary, like different solutes and water and electrolytes. And then there's another pressure which tries to keep the water inside of the actual capillary. Albumin is playing a role in this. And the reason why that's important is imagine here's the tissue cells, right? In between the blood and the tissues is the interstitial fluid, right? Now, let's imagine here for a second that your albumin levels were low. What would happen? A lot of the water in this area would accumulate a lot. And then that would lead to swelling of the interstitium. That's called edema. That's why albumin is so important, and we should really fluid of the actual capillary. Albumin is playing, you know that in the capillary there's hydrostatic pressure, pressure that pushes things out of the actual capillary, like different solutes, a little capillary. Albumin maintains your osmotic pressure. So for example, let's say I had a capillary here. So here is a little capillary. You know that in the capillary there's hydrostatic pressure, pressure that pushes things out of the actual capillary, like different solutes and water and electrolytes. And then there
maybe a post electrolyte drop the cell into the cell.
Another pressure which tries to keep the water inside of the actual capillary. Albumin is playing a role in this. And the reason why that's important is imagine here's the tissue cells, right? So here's a couple tissue cells. In between the blood and the tissues is the interstitial fluid, right? Now, let's imagine here for a second that your albumin levels were low. What would happen? A lot of the water in this area would accumulate a lot. And then that would lead to swelling of the interstitium. That's called edema. That's why albumin is so important, and we should really understand this guy. Also, when people have a long-term or severe injury to the liver, like due to hepatitis or cirrhosis, whatever the etiology might be, one of the long-term signs that there is liver damage is the albumin production starts decreasing. As well as, you'll see in other proteins that they make is they make a lot of clotting factors. So what's called their prothrombin time, the time it takes for them to clot basically, that's also a lot longer, okay? So that's the really important protein that I want you guys to remember here. Other ones, it makes a bunch of different proteins, and these guys are called your globulins. There's alpha and there's beta globulins.
Alpha, beta.
Now, out of these guys are your transport proteins. They're the ones that transport a lot of different lipid-soluble substances, like maybe steroid hormones or steroid-based substances, or things that like trace minerals like copper and iron and stuff like that, okay? So for example, just to name a few of these guys, let's say I have one, I already mentioned copper. There's a protein that transports that. It's called ceruloplasmin, okay? Super important. It transports copper. And that transports that. It's called ceruloplasmin. Okay, super important. It transports copper.
Ceruloplasmin.
Reason why this is important is you know that there is a disease called Wilson's disease, pretty rare. But what happens is this copper overload disorder. There's a protein called ATP7B, and it's what's responsible for taking the copper and combining it onto the ceruloplasmin. If that protein is actually defective, then the copper levels will actually start increasing.
Actually, defective, then copper level starting
And lead to a lot of free radical reactions. So that guy's super important that we should understand. Also remember that the copper is also secreted into our biliary system too. Other ones, we also mentioned iron. There's another protein called transferrin. And transferrin is responsible for transporting iron. He takes the iron and delivers it to the various different tissues. One is going to be the bone marrow. And transferrin is responsible for transporting iron. He takes the iron and delivers it to the various different tissues. One is going to be the bone marrow because that's needed for erythropoiesis. And transferrin is responsible for transporting iron. He takes the iron and delivers it to the various different tissues. One is going to be the bone marrow because that's needed for erythropoiesis, and it takes it to the liver, and the liver will actually store that iron in the form of ferritin, or if we have
liver transferring ដឹកនាំ transferring ដឹកនាំដៃហើយដៃអាចទៅក្នុងថ្លប់ដែលនៅក្នុងកោសិកាថ្លប់ផ្សេងៗវានឹងបំលែងទៅជា transferring ferritin ferrin នឹងទៅជា ferrin apoferrin នឹងជា ferritin បើនៅក្នុងឆ្អឹងវាមាន ferrin និង apoferrin for erythropoiesis.
A lot of ferritin that can polymerize and form hemosiderin. Okay.
Hemosiderin.
Other ones, haptoglobin. Haptoglobin. Sometimes, when there is hemolysis of our red blood cells, the breaking of the red blood cells, hemoglobin can be released. And some of that hemoglobin, we need to bind it onto haptoglobin. Okay, because hemoglobin is actually pretty toxic inside of our actual blood on its own. So that's important too. Other ones, let's say that we have, we have what's called retinol binding protein. So retinol binding protein, this guy's super important. He actually, you'll see later when we talk about the storage function of the liver, the retinol binding protein actually binds onto retinol and transports the retinol to various different tissues. What is one of the big tissues that retinol is needed in? In the eyes. It's needed for the actual dim light vision, right? So that's important. It's also utilized in our skin. It also transports different types of steroid hormones. For example, cortisol. Cortisol is actually transported via what's called transcortin. And then thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is transported in the form of what's called thyroxine binding globulins. So tons and tons of proteins. I'm not going to keep going through all of these bad boys. But I just want you guys to get the idea that the alpha and beta globulins are designed to be able to act as carrier proteins, to transport substances that are lipid soluble, they're hydrophobic in other words, or that can be super dangerous and can lead to a lot of free radicals, specifically the iron and the copper. These guys can lead to a lot of dangerous reactions, particularly if you guys know, we'll talk about it later, the Fenton reactions. Pretty dangerous stuff. Okay, so they're transporting steroid-based substances or ions or metals, okay? Well, some other proteins that the liver makes besides these bad boys, it also is responsible for making different types of clotting proteins and anti-clotting proteins. So, for example, let's say I have clotting proteins. You guys know a lot of these. There's so many of them, right? So, but here's the ones that I want you guys to remember. The big ones. Factor 2, okay? Factor 7. Factor 9, factor 10, protein C, and protein S. The reason why I want you guys to remember these is these suckers right here are vitamin K dependent. So in order for these proteins to become active, they need to have vitamin K. Okay, so that's some really important ones. So it makes a lot of different clotting proteins. Another one that's really important here in the clotting cascade is it also makes what's called fibrinogen. Okay, fibrinogen, which is actually factor 1. That's important for the fibrin mesh. As you guys remember, fibrinogen was acted on by factor. There's actually thrombin or factor 2. And what that did is that converted fibrinogen into fibrin, and then fibrin was responsible for forming that fibrin mesh that anchored down that platelet plug. And if you remember, factor 13 actually takes and cross-links the fibrin strands to really anchor down that fibrin mesh. So that's really important. As a side, to oppose the clotting, it also likes to keep a nice little balance. It also makes these anti-clotting proteins. So if here, let's word it like that, anti-clotting proteins. So what are some of these bad boys that it makes? It makes what's called, you guys should know this one, plasminogen. Plasminogen, super important one. If you guys remember, plasminogen is acted on by an enzyme called TPA. Right? Whenever someone has an acute thrombus or something like that, whenever they might have a clot, we give them TPA. Why? Because TPA converts plasminogen into plasmin. And what was plasmin's job? Remember, we represented this as like a nice little Pac-Man-like enzyme. And what was it breaking down? It was breaking down the fibrin. And it was spitting it out in the form of fibrinogen. And sometimes you might even see it in the form of what's called D-dimers. Sometimes that's why somebody has an elevated D-dimer, they might have actually had some type of clot, right? So that's really important. He makes plasminogen. What's another really important one that he makes? Another really important guy is called antithrombin 3. If you guys remember, antithrombin 3 binds with heparin sulfate on top of our endothelium. And antithrombin 3 was responsible for degrading particular types of clotting factors. And what were some of those? Out of all of these, if you guys remember, just remember that it inhibits or deactivates factor 2, which is thrombin. It also
7.
deactivates factor 9, and it also
7.
deactivates factor 10. So that was some of the things that you guys should remember here. Okay, so we got clotting proteins, anti-clotting proteins. What are some of the other ones? Here's what I love about this guy. He also can make hormones. So what are some of these hormones? This is what's super interesting. Most people don't know, most people forget about this when they think about the liver. Another thing's really interesting about the liver, I know I go off on tangents a little bit, but you know the liver is actually the site of red blood cell production in the fetus. So it actually starts off in the primitive yolk sac, and then the liver carries out the erythropoietic process till about the 32nd week of gestation when the bone marrow takes over. But there's another thing that it also controls. It actually makes a particular hormone called thrombopoietin. And thrombopoietin, if you guys remember, we talked about it very, very briefly. There's what's called the
clotting protein, clotting 2, clotting protein, clotting 2, clotting 7, clotting 8, 9, and CS, and clotting 2, 7, 9, 10 CS, as well protein K, and fibrinogen. Fibrinogen means anti-clotting. Anti-clotting means inhibition to the clotting protein 2, 9, 10, yeah, see? 2, 9, 10. This is anti-thrombi. Anti-thrombi 2, inhibition to the anti-protein 2, 9, 10. Plasminogen. Plasminogen là chia plasmin. Em nói bao nhiêu chia plasmin được một protein factor. Plasmin transmarker ấy là thế. Plasminogen.
myeloid stem cell, if you guys remember that, right?
Fibrinogen. Trong vitamin clotting. Clotting protein mean clotting 2 mean 7 mean 4 mean protein C as activated by vitamin K. Kapan nanti? Oh, fibrinogen. Protein mean fibrinogen hay tiếpគឺanti-clotting protein ដែលវាមាន plasminogen plus ដែលវាមាន plasminogen biology plasmin okay and then nó từ fibrinogen fibrin từ fibrin viên anh là chỉ fibrinogen I call it the GD mental. Okay. Này thằng nắng vì người của họ muốn. Oh shit. Chúng ta đi strong. The next stimulate inhibition of the protein 2 9 10 hormone.
And what it does is thrombopoietin actually leads to the platelet synthesis. So platelet formation. If you guys remember, we said that thrombopoietin will take a pluripotent stem cell. We have what's called pluripotent stem cell or hemocytoblast, converts it into a myeloid stem cell. And then thrombopoietin will stimulate that myeloid stem cell to turn into a megakaryoblast. Then it goes to a promegakaryocyte, and then a megakaryocyte, and then the megakaryocyte starts shedding platelets. And then these platelets are important for actually helping to form blood clots, right? For plugging different holes inside of the blood vessels. Another hormone is called insulin-like growth factor 1. We talked about this in the growth hormone video, okay? And what does this guy do? If you guys remember, it acted on muscles, it acted on bones, it acted on cartilage, and it increased the protein synthesis in these guys. So it helped to be able to increase the muscle size and muscle density. It helped to be able to increase the endochondral ossification. It also helped to increase interstitial growth and collagen type 1 production. So that's an important one. What's another one? This guy is so darn cool. Angiotensinogen. And if you guys remember, angiotensinogen is acted on by renin, which is secreted by the JG cells in the kidney. That converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin 1 is acted on by ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme in the lungs. And eventually, that's converted into angiotensin 2. And if you guys remember, angiotensin 2 is super important. It involves an ADH release, aldosterone release, vasoconstriction of our blood vessels, all designed to increase the blood pressure. So we know it has albumin, alpha beta globulins, clotting proteins, anti-clotting proteins, hormones. What's another really important one that I want to finish off with here? Let's do one more really big one, and that's immune, okay? It also makes a lot of different immune proteins. Now, out of these, there's at least 2 that you should remember, okay? Let's just do 2. So out of these, one is the complement proteins. We talked about this in our immunology playlist, right? There's complement proteins C1 to C9, and they're involved in the alternative pathway, the classical pathway, and even they're also involved in the lectin pathway. What was the significance? So the big significance with these guys. They're involved in what's called opsonization. What does that mean? Okay, let's imagine here I have a piece of bread. Ugh. But then you take some Nutella, rub that all across that bad boy. What does it do? It makes it a lot tastier. That's what these is albumin, alpha beta globulin.
Thromboprotein ទៅជា plug information thromboprotein ទៅជា plug informationហើយIgF what inhibition factor inhibition growth factor what activate នៅក្នុងទៅជា muscle bone cartilage muscle bone cartilage androgen ប្រើទៅក្នុងបើចេញមកដើម្បីប្រើទៅជា androgen 2 thromboid ទៅជា platelet formation inhibition factor 1 ប្រើនៅក្នុង muscle store នៅក្នុង muscle store នៅក្នុង bone store នៅក្នុង cartilage ហើយ
It's clotting proteins, anti-clotting proteins, hormones. What's another really important one that I want to finish off with here? Let's do one more really big one, and that's immune, okay? It also makes a lot of different immune proteins.
Immune protein.
Now, out of these,
Immune trắng thịt.
there's at least two that you should remember, okay? Let's just do two. So out of these, one is the complement proteins. We talked about this in our immunology playlist, right? There's complement proteins C1 to C9, and they're involved in the alternative pathway, the classical pathway, and even they're also involved in the lectin pathway. What was the significance? So the big significance with these guys. They're involved in what's called opsonization. What does that mean? Okay, let's imagine here I have a piece of bread. Ugh. But then you take some Nutella. Rub that all across that bad boy. What does it do? It makes it a lot tastier. That's what these complement proteins are doing. They're increasing the tastiness of the bacteria or pathogens, which enhances the phagocytosis process. And you also remember that they can act as chemotactic agents, C3A and C5A, okay? One more is C-reactive. That's what these complement proteins are doing. They're increasing the tastiness of the bacteria or pathogens, which enhances the
recovery being Christian to taste autolysis. Testiness of bacteria or pathogen.
What does it do? It makes it a lot tastier. That's what these complement proteins are doing. They're increasing the tastiness of the bacteria or pathogen,
Increases testiness.
which enhances the phagocytosis process.
Oh. Phagocytosis.
And you also remember that they can act as chemotactic agents, C3A and C5A, okay? One more is C-reactive peptide. Please remember this one. C-reactive peptide. So C-reactive peptide is important because this guy is when, let's say you take a blood panel, you test their blood, and you see that they have elevated C-reactive peptide levels. What does that mean? That means that the person has active inflammation. It's a sign of that, right? There's a hormone, interleukin called interleukin-6, as well as interleukin-1 and tumor necrotic factor alpha that can be released whenever there's inflammation by macrophages. And it stimulates the liver to produce C-reactive peptide, and that's actually an inflammation marker. But what C-reactive peptides do is they act as opsonins. So they actually activate the complement system. And that is important. So if you can see here, look at this. This is just unbelievable what the actual liver can do. And this doesn't include all of them. That's what makes it even more amazing. Okay, so this is just a few of the proteins that the liver is making that I want us to kind of just get a basic view of. Oh, one.
Immune protein. Immune protein, immune complement. Complement protein. C1 or C5. Remain C-reactive. Oxytocin, C-oxytocin, optic,
One more that I completely forgot about, shouldn't forget this one, is it's also responsible for making these things called apoproteins. Apoproteins. We talked about these a lot in lipid metabolism, the lipoprotein metabolism. And if you guys remember, it was APO A, APO B, APO C, and APO E. Obviously, we talked a lot about APO A1, B100, B48, C2, and APO E. So it synthesizes a lot of those apoproteins, which is significant in our lipoprotein metabolism. Okay, so that covers the gist of the protein factory. Let's come over here and let's hit it home with the storage function. All right, so to finish it all up, guys, we're going to talk about the storage function of the liver. Okay, so here's what I want you guys to remember. It stores fat-soluble vitamins, primarily A, D, E, and K. As we're going to talk about the storage function of the liver. Okay, so here's what I want you guys to remember. It stores fat-soluble vitamins, primarily A, D, E, and K, as well as vitamin B12, okay? And we'll talk about its storage of trace minerals like copper and iron, okay? So let's start off first with the vitamins. So obviously, all of these vitamins. So here, let's imagine here, you have what's called your chylomicrons. And the chylomicrons, if you guys remember, they were transporting triglycerides, cholesterol, phospholipids, as well as vitamins A, D, E, and K. Now, these chylomicrons, you know, they go through the lymphatic system and into the circulation, and then they get taken to the liver. D, E, and K. Okay. Now, these chylomicrons, you know, they go through the lymphatic system and into the circulation, and then they get taken to the liver. Now, let's see what it does with each one of these guys. I don't want to go crazy over all of them. I want to focus on two primarily. So let's do those two important ones that I want to really focus on. That's vitamin D and vitamin K. So a lot of the vitamin D can be brought via the diet. But here's the other one that I want to talk about. A significant amount of vitamin D is actually coming from our skin. You know, our skin has a cholesterol molecule in it called 7-dehydrocholesterol. So what is this molecule called? It's called 7-dehydrocholesterol. Holy frick, that's a long name, right? So when sunlight, let's say photons, look at this. Here's some photons. Some photons are hitting the skin. It actually can take the 7-dehydrocholesterol and convert it into another molecule. And what it does, it converts into what's called cholecalciferol. I'm not going to spell it out. That's
cholesterol, and cholesterol, cholecalciferol.
Too crazy. CCF. Now, this cholecalciferol will then go to the liver. Okay, now the liver's job in this is it takes, let's say here's the liver. Here's the liver, here's a little baby liver. Here's your falciform ligament. It has an enzyme called 25-hydroxy. See? 25-hydroxylase. So we're just going to put here this guy right here. There's an enzyme called 25-hydroxylase. And what that does, it puts a hydroxyl on the 25th carbon of this cholesterol derivative. And this is now going to be called 25-hydroxycholecalciferol. Now, from here, it'll then go to another organ. It'll go to your kidneys. Okay, so now let's just draw a little baby kidney. And let's get this little guy over here. Little baby kidney. Okay, now the little baby kidney has a particular enzyme in it, and this is called 1-hydroxylase. 1-hydroxylase. What that 1-hydroxylase does is, what do you think it does? It puts a hydroxyl group on the 1 carbon of this cholecalciferol, which is this cholesterol derivative, and converts it into 1, 25
dihydroxycholecalciferol. Holy crap. Now, what is this guy? This is the active form
Chúng ta tiếp nha. Đơn này.
of the vitamin D. That's the active form. Now, what this does is this 1,25 dihydroxycholecalciferol is he goes to your GI tract. So for example, he'll come here to your GI tract, and when he comes to your GI tract, it increases your calcium absorption. It activates particular genes that increase the synthesis of calcium binding proteins, and that's going to lead to increased calcium absorption. Pretty cool, huh? All right. So that's the one there. So this one right here is specifically for your vitamin D. Okay? So that's its function there. What's another thing that it can do? Another thing is we said we were going to focus on vitamin K. Okay, so what is vitamin K here? Let's actually take here this baby blue here. So now, again, here's going to be the next one, vitamin K. Well, vitamin K, here's what I want you guys to remember. Super, super important, and we already talked about in certain clotting proteins. So what happens is, here's the cool thing with vitamin K. Vitamin K comes in two forms. There's what's called the oxidized form, which is usually in the form of an epoxide. And then there's another one called the vitamin K that's in the reduced form. So now this is in the reduced form. And then these guys can go back and forth. So we can take this vitamin K in the oxidized form, convert it to vitamin K in the reduced form. Now, there's an enzyme here. Let's do this guy here in red. This is called, that converts the oxidized form into the reduced form.
Yes, chemical conversion oxide campus and reduced form refer to loss or gain of electron. Loss and gain of electron. Respective oxide campus oxidation is the process where molecular atom or ion loss electron increasing the oxide state. The oxide state conversion is the process where molecular atom or ion electron decrease. The process where molecular atom decreasing is reduction. Gain electron. Oxide count. Low electron drop. Reduction. G-oxide core.
And this is called vitamin K epoxide reductase. Now, why is that important? You know, there's a drug called warfarin. They use it in trying to treat patients who have, increased incidences of clotting or maybe even atrial fibrillation. They use this as a blood thinner because what it does is it inhibits the vitamin K epoxide reductase. If that happens, vitamin K in the oxidized form can go to vitamin K in the reduced form. Why is that important? I'm glad you asked, guys. Because guess what happens? There's proteins, factor 2, factor 7, factor 9, factor 10, protein C, and protein S. So protein C and protein S. And if you really want, there's another one called protein Z. But all of these guys, they're in this inactive form. So inactive. When they interact with the vitamin K in the reduced form through a specific enzyme here called a carboxylase enzyme, it converts these guys into their active form. So that's important here. And again, what is the enzyme that's triggering this process to go from the reduced back to the oxidized? This is called a carboxylase enzyme. Okay, so that is the significance there with the vitamin K. Now, the vitamin A, what's its significance here? Well, the vitamin A is pretty darn cool as well, but there's not a lot that we really need to talk about with this one. So for example here, let's say I take the next one, the vitamin A. The vitamin A, when we absorb it across our GIT and the form within the chylomicrons, it's usually coming in the form of what's called retinol esters. What happens is we take this bad boy to our liver, okay? And the liver, let's draw another little baby liver, okay? What it does is it has particular enzymes that convert the retinol esters into retinol.
Retinol.
And then another thing the liver does is it produces a protein that will actually bind onto the retinol. Look at this. Here we're gonna have a protein that binds onto, we already mentioned this protein. It's called retinol binding protein. Look at that. And then guess what can happen here? This retinol, when it's bound to the retinol binding protein, we can take it to different peripheral tissues. What are some of the tissues? One is it can go to the skin. And the other one is we could take it to, you know, the rods within inside of the eyes, like particularly in the retina, right? Because it's important for our dim vision.
Rod nó chỉ có các đồng bó này. Có các đồng bó. Rod. Để cho có các cao đồng bó rod. Có các đồng. Ok, cho vitamin A, retinol acid, retinol ester. Retinol ester. Retinol binding protein.
So that's one thing. Another thing is we can take that retinol and instead of binding it onto the retinol binding protein, guess what we can do with that retinol? We can store it. So it can be stored in these special little cells located in the space of Dissy. And these are little cells here. Guess what these little buggers are? These are called your stellate cells. And your stellate cells are important because they can take that retinol and they can store it. So that would be important within the storage of the actual vitamin A, and then it can be released out into the circulation, bind onto the retinol binding protein, and then be utilized to different various tissues, right? So that's the significance there. The next one is vitamin E. Now vitamin E is also important, but he is really, really specific in the antioxidant function. So again, we take it through the chylomicrons, take it to the liver, and the vitamin E, okay, it's actually carried via the chylomicrons. When we take it to the liver, what the liver actually does with it is it'll take the vitamin E and incorporate it into what's called your VLDLs. So it'll incorporate it into the VLDLs. And also, you know, the VLDLs, we know that some of it actually is converted into IDLs, some of it's converting into LDLs. So what's important with this is it has the antioxidant function. Okay, because you know what happens when the LDL particles can undergo oxidation, it can lead to atherogenesis. So guess what this vitamin E is for? It's specifically carried within a lot of these lipoproteins to prevent the oxidized particles can undergo oxidation, it can lead to atherogenesis. So guess what this vitamin E is for? It's specifically carried within a lot of these lipoproteins to prevent the oxidized particles from actually causing a lot of the atherogenic effects. So its antioxidant function can be designed to try to decrease atherosclerosis or atherogenesis. So that's pretty darn cool if you think about it. It's specifically carried within a lot of these lipoproteins to prevent the oxidized particles from actually causing a lot of the atherogenic effects. So its antioxidant function can be designed to try to decrease atherosclerosis or atherogenesis.
Zero sclerosis.
So that's pretty darn cool if you think about it. Okay.
Antioxidant is substance that prevent or slow sediment, scope unstable molecule. Unstable what's called free radical. Electron domain and free electron and free radical. They can antioxidant. They can ask neutralize free radical which is linked to body tissue. The gain antioxidant គឺជាម៉ូលេគុលដែលការពារកោសិកាពី damage ដែលបង្កឡើងដោយ radical សេរីភាពមិនលំនឹងនៃម៉ូលេគុលនឹងភ្ជាប់ទៅនឹងត្រូវ free វិទ្យុសកម្មអាចធ្វើឲ្យមានការធ្វើការតាំងនៃការធ្វើប្រូតុងផ្ទេរប្រូតុងដែលនាំឲ្យកោសិការងការខូចខាតនឹងរួមចូលជាមួយនឹងភ្នាក់ងារដែលបង្កផ្សេងៗអន្តរវិទ្យាសកម្មនៅfree radical ដោយការផ្ដល់ឲ្យនៅអេឡិចត្រូនដោយគ្មានលំនឹងនៃពួកគេជាលំនឹងដូចជាប្រតិកម្មណាមួយដែលមើលទៅគ្មានលំនឹងដែលមើលទៅរៀងរាយញ៉ៃគឺ anti oxidation គឺវាផ្ដល់ជំនួយឲ្យវិទ្យាអេឡិចត្រូនទោះបីជាពួកគេត្រូវកាត់បន្ថយ reducing oxidative damage ហើយកាត់បន្ថយការប៉ះអុកស៊ីតកម្ម common antioxidant including vitamin C ចឹងហ្នឹងវីតាមីនណា vitamin C វីតាមីន E beta carotene flavonoid នៅក្នុងផ្លែឈើនៅក្នុងបន្លែនិងផ្សេងៗនៅក្នុងរូបជីវជាតិទៀតជាដែលការប្រើប្រាស់antioxidant ច្រើននៅក្នុងអាហារវាគឺជួយឲ្យសុខភាពយើងល្អកាត់បន្ថយជំងឺរ៉ាំរ៉ៃantioxidant អញ្ចឹងការពារ cell from damage is covered radio free okay ចុះ what is radio free radical free radical គឺជាម៉ូលេគុលឬមួយក៏អាតូមដែលភ្ជាប់ making high reactive material it is an unpenetrable for free radical which includes another molecule liberation free radicals in space physics as 10 single ampere electron proton W ampere neutron outer bit ampere neutron ampere Hertziatom highly reactive unstable oxygen molecule. The nation cancer institute write the free radicals are created when atom or molecular gas or lose an electron on the physical and free. And oxidate play dual role in both toxic and beneficial parasites. They are either harmful or helpful, but they are produced either from normal cell metabolism or substitute from internal source. Population group response population group small radiation medication.
Now for the last two buggers here. Let's say we have to talk about the last one here. Oh, there's one more, vitamin B12. Again, vitamin B12, not crazy a lot of stuff to talk about with this one. Just remember that vitamin B12, we can actually take this, and it actually is transported to the liver. So let's imagine here, there's a transport to the liver, and when it's transported to the liver, it's actually transported by a specific protein produced by the liver. So look at this. There's a protein here made by the liver, and this protein is called transcobalamin. And if you want to be specific, it's actually transcobalamin type 2. And it binds onto the vitamin B12 and takes it to the liver. And then the liver can actually store that vitamin B12 in the form of transcobalamin 1, or it can secrete that out, right? So we can take that vitamin B12 and we can take it to various tissues. What's one tissue that is really needed for the vitamin B12? The bone marrow. So we can take this to the red bone marrow, right? And the red bone marrow needs this. And the reason why the red bone marrow needs this is it's a precursor or a necessity for erythropoiesis. What else? You know, vitamin B12 is also really important for DNA synthesis. It's involved in the folic acid pathway, right? So that's important too. Okay, so we covered the basic of the vitamins. Now the next thing that I really want to talk about is the copper and the iron. So let's say here I have
synthesis.
We've already talked a lot about this in the individual videos, but let's say here's an enterocyte. And you know that the iron is brought in to the enterocyte via specific proteins like DMT1, divalent metal transporter. And then from here, we can actually push it out through particular proteins located on the basolateral membrane. This is the really important one called ferroportin. If you guys remember, it's very important.
Ferroprotein. Ferroprotein, apoprotein, mod dihydrogenation.
Or ferroimportant. And then what happens is the iron there is bound to a particular protein. And what is that protein here that binds onto it? That protein is called transferrin. And then that transferrin, if you guys remember, is going to take the iron to the liver. And the liver is going to take up a lot of this.
Bind ជាមួយនឹង transferrin របស់ដែលមកពីខ្លាចុងវាគឺជា iron binding protein វាគឺជា iron binding protein ហើយវាត្រូវការ transport ចូលទៅក្នុង
It's going to take up the iron, and what it's going to do with the iron is it's going to store it, right? So we can take this iron, let's say here's the iron, we can take it inside of these liver cells, and we can bind it to what's called ferritin, Okay, actually it's originally apoferritin. When it binds up to the iron, it becomes ferritin. And if there's a lot of ferritin molecules, they can be converted into hemosiderin. This is important because whenever there's high
ferritin. Liver and install apoferrin, then install transferrin, with a strategy, start transferrin with a strategy apoferrin, hemosiderin. Hemosiderin.
levels of this hemosiderin or high levels of the iron, the liver makes a protein called hepcidin. And then hepcidin, if you guys remember, actually is responsible for regulating the ferroportin. So if there's high levels of iron, the actual liver will produce a protein called hepcidin. Hepcidin will inhibit the ferroportin, which will inhibit the iron absorption. Why is this important? Because if some people are not able to release the hepcidin, if there's a deficiency or mutation, it can produce a disease referred to as hemochromatosis. Okay? Why is this super dangerous? Why is iron so dangerous if it's built up in a lot of levels?
Absidin. For regulate ferroportin. For regulate apoferrin. For regulate ferroportin.
Hemochromatosis. Mutation, if they're important, which will inhibit the iron absorption. Why is this important? Because if some people are not able to release the hepcidin, if there's a deficiency or mutation, it can produce a disease referred to as hemochromatosis.
Hemochromatosis is deficiency of absidin produced by liver, and deficiency absidin produced by liver, and it causes overload or produce hemosiderin. you are deficient circulation function. Nightly digestion. Hemochromatosis, circulation controlled by excess iron absorption. Excess iron absorption and accumulation in body. You are deficient circulation. Right. Right.
Okay. Why is this super dangerous? Why is iron so dangerous if it's built up in a lot of levels, high levels? Iron can actually react with hydrogen peroxide inside of our cells. When it does that, it converts the iron from the +2 state to the +3 state, and it react with hydrogen peroxide inside of our cells. When it does that, it converts the iron from the +2 state to the +3 state, and it forms this really nasty molecule here called a hydroxyl radical. And this guy can cause a lot of damage. Okay? What kind of damage? It can damage our proteins, it can damage our DNA. It can damage our eye, can cause a lot of damage. Okay? What kind of damage? It can damage our proteins, it can damage our DNA, it can damage our cell membranes. So super, super nasty free radical. And this can actually, the dangerous thing here is that sometimes this guy right here can go right back to the iron 2+ by reacting with hydrogen peroxide. This is really
Institute cancer.
Really dangerous because this is called your Fenton reactions.
Frontal reaction.
And this is what can be really dangerous because it can actually damage the liver cells, and some of the iron can leak out into the blood and go to various tissues and damage those tissues as well. Okay, and the last one that I want to talk about is copper. So let's say we take the copper here. Let's do let's actually do this maroon. All right, so let's say here we have an enterocyte here. And again, we're gonna take up our copper. Now here's what you gotta remember. There is these little transporters there, divalent metal transporters that take up the copper. Now, the copper, when we take this bad boy up, we actually have the copper bound to another protein here. Let's say here's this protein. This one transports it to the liver. And this protein that binds onto it is actually called albumin. And then what will happen is this copper will be transported to the liver. Now, what happens with this copper? Let's say we take this copper out here. This copper here is super cool because what happens is he's gonna bind onto, there's gonna be a kind of like a protein shuttle, if you will. Let's take this guy here, let's draw him as ATP7B. Okay, so he's a super important protein that binds onto the copper and takes the copper and puts him into two different destinations. One is he can take the copper and transport it and actually excrete it out into the bile. Okay, so it can be excreted into the bile. There's specific transporters like MDR1, we'll talk about that, multi-drug resistant transporters, that it can excrete out the different types of organic cations. Okay? Another thing is, and this is just to maintain, we don't want to have copper build up inside of our liver cells because it's toxic. It can actually lead to free radical reactions.
Oh.
Some of it actually is going to bind onto the ATP7B, and it's going to be bound to, it's going to be transported, and there's another protein inside of our cell called apoceruloplasmin. When it reacts here, the ATP7B transfers the copper onto the apoceruloplasmin and converts this bad boy into ceruloplasmin. Now, here's the thing. In a crazy disease called Wilson's disease, there's damage, or I shouldn't say damage, there's a defect or mutation in which this ATP7B isn't produced. If that's the case, the Wilson's disease. There's damage, or I shouldn't say damage, there's a defect or mutation in which this ATP7B isn't produced. If that's the case, the copper can't be excreted into the bile, and the copper can't be bound to ceruloplasmin. So the free copper starts rising inside of the actual liver cells. Why is this bad? Same thing is that copper, what it can do is it can react with hydrogen peroxide. And when it reacts with the hydrogen peroxide, guess what it does? It takes and converts that into copper 2+. And this super dangerous molecule, let's put him in pink here, the hydroxyl radical. And again, what can this guy do? He can lead to a lot of oxidative stress. He can damage your DNA. He can damage your proteins. He can damage the cell membrane via lipid peroxidation. And so it's a really, really nasty little thing here. So again, this is really important that we should understand how the liver is actually storing all of these different types of fat-soluble vitamins or water-soluble vitamin, storing iron and storing copper, because if for just some reason there's a mutation in this gene, it can produce Wilson's disease. And Wilson's disease, you actually know how you can see that, one of the diagnostic signs? Copper can actually get put into a specific membrane inside of the cornea. You know, there's what's called the Desmond's membrane. And when the copper accumulates there, it produces these like brown pigmented rings called Kaiser-Fleischer rings. And that could be one of the diagnostic signs that there could be a copper accumulation. And also it can start really damaging your central nervous system. If you guys watched this whole video, can't thank you guys enough. I really appreciate it. If you guys like this video, please, I'm begging you, hit that like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. Also, if you guys get a chance, go check out our Facebook, our Instagram, and even our Patreon account. All right, Ninja Nerds, as always, until next time.
Metabolism stage is metabolism fasting stage. Called infantry storage push liver. Insulin ក្នុង metabolism liver metabolism protein synthesis and storage. Metabolism fish stage fasting stage. But infantry storage. Police. metabolism. State. Fasting state. Protein synthesis. You are learning important part of gene philosophy and metabolism. Why stay up late? GI habit is food, then the body absorption nutrient, then the nutrient use metabolism. Your body live or let's say your body responds different depending on what you just ate and have eaten in the hour and stone. Yes, stone. Okay, and is that how your body manage nutrients like glucose, fat, protein, the different the body split into dependent on food below. First stage, post-prandial state, which is a C2 បន្ទាប់ពី4 0 ទៅ 4 ម៉ោង C ភ្លាមៗត្រង់4 ម៉ោង glucose is high insulin release. Your body glucose are high insulin release. Your body uses glucose for energy. They will store the glucose as glycogen. Glycogen, the body stores fat storage increase. Protein are used for prepare and burn and building protein factory. Protein used for prepare and building protein factory. For example, glucose and GAP, extra glucose, glycogen in liver muscle, extra fat storage adipose tissue. Protein just to build muscle or enzyme. Just to build muscle or enzyme. Okay. អញ្ចឹងស៊ីបាយហើយគឺស្ករកាត់ឡើងលុបបែកបញ្ចេញអាំងស៊ីលីនមកដើម្បីរៀបចំទៅលើស្ករហើយការរៀបចំទៅលើស្ករមានទៅលើសាច់ដុំនិងថ្លើមនៅក្នុងនោះគឺមានវានៅផ្នែកជាខ្លាញ់ដែលគេហៅថា glycogen ហើយ glycogen ហ្នឹងគឺវាមានស្រាប់ហើយអញ្ចឹងការដែល glycogen បន្ថែមទៀតគេហៅថា extra glycogen វាត្រូវបានប្រើប្រាស់នៅក្នុងវាបាន store ទៀត extra glycogen មិនបាន store ទេ store ថែមក្នុង adipose tissue គឺជា tissue នៅក្នុងថ្លើមសុខការបំបែក metabolism ការបំបែកយក protein សម្រាប់សាច់ដុំហើយនឹងអង់ស៊ីម storage increase protein is used for repair. Strophes store adipose tissue protein just to be a muscle and enzyme fasting បន្ទាប់ពីរំលាយអាហាររួច fasting បន្ទាប់ពីរំលាយអាហាររួចពី4ទៅ24ម៉ោងបន្ទាប់ពីស៊ីបាយហើយ glucose start to drop glucose គឺចាប់ផ្ដើមទៅចុះ insulin គឺកើនឡើងហើយធ្វើផង acid factor គឺបងប្អូនឃ្លីកកគឺគឺធ្វើ glyconeogenesis យកខ្លាញ់នៅក្នុង adipose tissue យកនៅក្នុងអត់យកក្នុងសាច់ដុំទេយកនៅក្នុង liver ចេញមកខាងក្រៅដើម្បីបំលែងវាទៅជាស្ករវិញ okay okay liver break down glycogen to keep blood in normal ស្ករខ្លះឈាមអាចខ្វះស្ករឈាមអាចខ្វះស្ករអញ្ចឹងហើយ liver គឺ break use glycogen to break down glucagon break down glycogen your body fatty acid to start protein breakdown just body fatty acid to start body fatty acid to start protein breakdown just body fatty acid 6 line protein breakdown glycogen liver fatty acid fatty acid energy fatty acid muscle protein amino acid muscle protein muscle protein large amino acid large glucose អានោះបើសិនជាត្រូវការប៉ុន្តែជីទូទៅត្រូវកកងវាមិនអាចបំបែកវាមិនអាចបំបែក protein វាមិនអាចបំបែក fatty acid នៅក្នុងសាច់ដុំបានទេហ្នឹងហើយតែនឹងដំណើរការចុងក្រោយ last stage លើស24ម៉ោង glycogen គឺត្រូវបានចាប់ការងារ your body now make glucose for protein ឥឡូវនេះគឺត្រូវការប្រើប្រាស់ស្ករដែលមកពី protein សាច់ដុំនិងខ្លាញ់អញ្ចឹងលើសពី24ម៉ោងអត់ស៊ីបាយគឺចាប់ផ្ដើមយក protein របស់សាច់ដុំចេញមកខាងក្រៅហើយនឹងខ្លាញ់បន្ទាប់មកគោលក្បាលនឹង sniff to ketone bond sniff បាក់ជាពាក្យ sniff safe ផ្លាស់ប្ដូរ for protein breakdown បន្ទាប់មកគូក្បាលត្រូវបានផ្លាស់ប្ដូរទៅជាផលិតទៅជា ketone body សម្រាប់ខ្លាញ់និងការរក្សាទុក protein ketone body example ខ្លាញ់ជា ketone គឺសម្រាប់ brain energy យកស្ករដែលមានតិចតួចនេះបងប្ដូរវាជា ketone muscle protein glucose still happen but slower អញ្ចឹងតើពិបាកយកពី protein ពី muscle មកណាគេចង់យក protein ពី muscle មកគឺពិបាក starving លើពីមក protein factory anabolis នៅពេល nutrient គឺមាន protein fasting វា metabolic anabolis នៅពេលដែល available នៅពេលដែលសារធាតុមានដែលអាចជំនួសស្ករបាន protein from food used for making enzyme muscle has happen more and faster and grow happen let be faster and grow that enzyme amino acid storage anabolis storage saving access nutrient ក្រោយកោសទៅជា glycogen នៅក្នុងរយៈពេលខ្លីក្រោយកោសនឹងខ្លាយទៅជាខ្លាញ់ក្នុងរយៈពេលបើសិនជា glycogen ខ្លាញ់វាគឺរយៈពេលវែងfatty acid ដែលជា glycolic acid នៅក្នុង adipose tissue ដែលជា access fatty acid summary ចឹងនៅក្នុង state fat ដែល maintain hormone គឺ insulin ចេញមកវា maintain fuel ទៅលើ glucose ហើយមានទៀតប្រភពដែល fuel បំផុតនេះគឺcarbohydrate from food នៅក្នុងដំណាក់កាលដែលយើងចាប់ផ្ដើមស៊ីបាយភ្លាមៗក៏កន្លះ insulin ចេញមកហើយ main fuel គឺចូលរយៈពេលសល់ទុកលើ glucose ហើយប្រភពដែលធម្មពលគឺ carbon hydrate ដែលមកពីអាហារណាដែលសម្រាប់ការប្រើប្រាស់អត់ចាយប្រវេទទៅជាខ្លាញ់នេះគឺនៅទៅក្នុង adipose tissue ហើយគោលបំណងដើម្បីរក្សាទុកដោយប្រព័ន្ធការរក្សាទុកបានច្រើនគឺប្រនេះគឺរក្សាទុក fasting គឺលើសពី4ម៉ោងមានរំលាយអាហារអស់ហើយគ្រឿងកកត្រូវបានបញ្ចេញមកដើម្បីបំបែក glycogen បំបែក fatty acid ហ្នឹងណា fatty acid glycogen ដែលពីជាប្រភព glycogen ពេលតូននេះក្នុងម៉ាសមកបំបែកបានតែម៉ាសគឺជាម៉ាសក្រោយដែលសល់លំនៅlot នៅក្នុងឈាមគឺគាត់ក្នុងឡោ stuffing អត់ស៊ីបាយ24ម៉ោងខ្លុយកកងត្រូវបានបញ្ចេញមកហើយគោលបាគឺត្រូវការខ្លុយកកងហ្នឹងបំលែងអាស៊ីគេមានខ្លាញ់មានទៅជា ketone body ស្មារតីអេមានតែអាចទៅជា ketone body បានគឺត្រូវការបំបែកទៅដើម្បីទៅចំវាដើម្បីចាប់គោលបាខ្លាញ់គឺត្រូវការប្រើយ៉ាងយ៉ាងចឹងតាមដែលទៅខ្លាញ់ត្រូវបានបញ្ចេញទៅបាយដើម្បីរួមspare មក short ជាងវាអាចធ្វើប៉ះពាល់ទៅដល់ទីដោយសារតែយើងមកចាំមកសល់រួមទៅដូចជាយកខ្លាញ់ពីម៉ាសប៉ុន្តែវា small យកខ្លាញ់ protein បំលែងទៅជា ketone body សម្រាប់គូបានគឺវាយឺតមែនតើចឹងអាចមកពិសោធន៍ Cisco protein factory វាជា insulin ចឹងពេលស៊ីបាយទៀត insulin អាចប្រើជា amino acid ហើយប្រព័ន្ធរបស់វាគឺ dietary protein គោលដៅវាគឺជួសជុលនិង repair tissue protein factory ហើយនិយាយពីតួនាទីប្រសិនការស្តតុក insulin ខ្លីកុំនឹងខ្លាញ់កាល carbohydrate ជាខ្លាញ់នៅក្នុងថ្លៃសម្រាប់នេះ fatty acid ដូចជា fat pro energy saving energy from the carbon every state linked to each other your body consistent between them dependent on what you eat how much you eat and energy you need understanding that have full connectivity system with the whole body metabolism Glucose broadly into glucose transporter. Metabolism of glucose affected functioning by insulin, hormone secretion by pancreatic B-cell. Gluconeogenesis, glycogenesis glycogenesis is converted to storage from glycogen. Exomus pathway is called Potopos of pathway glucose is converted to phosphate. Synergical is conversion into generation of energy hormone to get synthesis metabolism oxidation reaction. Gluconeogenesis is critical. Okay, GDP periods energy level paramedical intensity. Short glucose from glucose in short term ATP during glycolysis and Krebs cycle. ATP amino acid ដែលបានមកពី insulin វានឹងឲ្យទៅដល់ពី glucagon ដែលវានឹងអាចឡើងទៅជាវាអាចបំលែងវាអាចមានលទ្ធភាពបំលែងទៅជា acetyl-CoA អញ្ចឹងវា relate កាលណា amino acid អាចបំលែងទៅជា acetyl-CoA acetyl-CoA ក៏អាចនៅក្នុង វា acidic ដែរអញ្ចឹង energy គឺត្រូវបានមួយទៀត amino acid ក៏អាចទៅជា protein ហើយ protein អាច storage សម្រាប់ muscle ឡើងវិញដែល muscle ត្រូវបាន repair ដល់យើងអត់ជីបានទៅយូរអូខេចឹង citrate citrate ក៏អាចទៅជា acetyl-CoA ហើយអាចជា acetyl-CoA ដូចគ្នា melamine fatty acid វាអាចបំលែងទៅជា cycline ដែលអាចប្រថាពល glycerol ក៏ជា cycline ដែរ cycline មកផងវានឹងនៅក្នុង silicon ដូចគ្នាទេហើយនៅនេះគឺជាពួក lymphatic system នេះ triglyceride និង cholesterol វាជា free fatty acid ដែលវាមិនតែក្នុងឈាមហើយវាអាចទៅជា triglyceride cholesterol វាអាចចូលទៅក្នុង acid ថងទឹកប្រាក់ហើយ cholesterol ester ត្រូវបាន store cholesterol ester ឬមួយក៏ boxer store គឺវាខ្លះជា cholesterol ឬមួយក៏វាទៅជា high density lipoprotein វាអាចមានជា cholesterol បានដែរដោយសារប្រកាសឡើងគឺ glucagon វាបំបែកបន្តទៀតជាមួយនឹង triglyceride ទៅវា very low density lipoprotein ហើយវាទៅជា immediate lipoprotein គឺវា relate គ្នាទៅនឹង cholesterol មានលុបនេះនោះទៅលើសិcholesterol ទៅវាទៅតគ្នាមក fatty acid វាក៏គ្នាមកវាទៅហើយយើងបានអត់ពីណាcholesterol dihydrogenat acetyl-phosphate ក៏ជា cholesterol melamine dihydrogenat acetyl-phosphate into glycerol inhibition required. In case where excess large amount of acetyl-CoA inhibition required low ATP converting into citrate isocitrate inhibition there are citrate elastic breakdown to citrate levels. Okay, acetyl convert to glycerol is common fatty acid triglyceride. Amino acid metabolism. Amino acid brought into the cell via sodium it depends on balance. So you have to low amino acid were designed to generate protein very important. Generate protein transport along with amino acid. Amino acid brought amino acid metabolism where the level amino acid excess in high some of acid is converted into acetyl-CoA, citrate, malonyl fatty acid. Fatty acid can combine with glycerol to form triglyceride. So, triglyceride from energy. So 12. Reversive function of fat and cholesterol from shimmer important because they take a lot of the result. Reversive exogenous fat and cholesterol from shimmer micron important because they take a lot of the result. Triglyceride and send amount of the triglycerides component fatty acid. Cholesterol is three fat of cholesterol. Cholesterol is the form as the cholesterol as steroid from the cholesterol is converted out. Cholesterol is catalyzed by acetyl-CoA acetyltransferase. Cholesterol gas converted acid to zinc. Available perform very low risk. Function is caused through circulation to reduce cholesterol. Function of those through circulation contribute to cholesterol to this. Over lipoprotein metabolism variable return into idea. Some variable become earlier is attribute cholesterol and bad acid. They are bad cholesterol, the cholesterol to periprotein is combined into the liver. High density liver lipoprotein intermittent. High density lipoprotein, low density triglycerol from the other hand, triglycerol from the protein contribute to cholesterol to on other hand, cholesterol trade from periprotein activate cholesterol ទៅជា activate cholesterol នៅក្នុង periprotein ទៅជា cholesterol ដែលប្រើប្រាស់បាទហើយវា LDL គឺ return into ideal ដើម្បីឲ្យ some LDL become LDL which contribute cholesterol periprotein is combined to liver ដើម្បីទុកcholesterol សិនតែមិនចាំបាច់ទៅឲ្យវាចូលខ្លួនអូខេsee